One of the most common questions I'm asked is, should you rent or own where you live? And in the past, I've always just told people that it's a personal choice, but looking back, I realized that I didn't give those people justice with that answer. So I decided to look at the cold, hard facts. I put my finance degree to work, and I conducted a full financial analysis to really see which is better, owning or renting your primary residence. The mathematical answer surprised me, and I'm gonna share what I've learned. And if you are new to the channel, my name's Justin Yahrong. I'm a real estate investor and entrepreneur here in Las Vegas. I've made hundreds of videos teaching people about real estate. And the goal of this channel is to help you grow your money and mindset. Also, if you wanna see more personal content, follow me on Instagram at Justin Yahrong. Okay, so what we are looking at right now is a cost analysis for owning a home right here versus renting a home. The final answer is going to be in these boxes right here, and I'm not gonna show you that until the end. But I highly encourage you to look at this whole thing and watch this entire video just so you can get an idea of how I came to that conclusion. So essentially what I'm gonna be doing is I'm gonna be comparing the cost associated with owning a home and the cost associated with rent. And just to set the stage right here, I'm doing this analysis with the assumption of 13 years, because on average, the homeowner will own a home for 13 years. And after 13 years on average in the US, they're going to sell their home. So this study or this experiment is over the course of 13 years. So that's just the basis of this. And the first thing that I want you to look at, I know you might be a little bit overwhelmed with what you're seeing on the screen here. Just focus on this first part right here, the ownership cost. So everything else, just ignore for now. I will get to everything as we go. But basically, whenever people start to compare the idea of should you rent a home or should you own a home, they're often looking just at the rent versus just the mortgage payment. But in reality, there are so many other costs associated with owning a home that are not there when you rent a home. And some people think that it's just the repairs and the maintenance that you have to account for. But in reality, there are so many other costs, and I'm gonna delve super deep into each one just so you get a full understanding of what it really takes to be a homeowner and how much cost that it takes to own a home on average. So everything you are looking here are based on averages, based on the national averages. So basically, by the end of this analysis, and once I go through all the different costs associated with owning a home versus all the cost that comes with renting a home, you will know exactly which one is better and which one is worse in different scenarios. So first thing that I want you to look at are the purchase costs that are associated with owning a home. So the first thing that we're gonna be looking at, in this assumption, I am just using a sample home of $500,000 as a purchase price with a 20% down payment. Now I know you're arguing already, hey, can't you just put less and put a 3.5% down payment? Yes, but in reality, it doesn't make that much of a difference, because even if you were to pay less as a down payment, you would have less purchase costs, but eventually your mortgage at the end of the 13 years right here, your mortgage would be much higher. So it all balances out whatever down payment you use. I tested the numbers. So purchase costs, we're gonna be looking at a 20% down payment of a $500,000 home right here. And we're also going to be accounting for closing costs. So we're accounting for 2% of closing costs. And I got that 2% number by this statistic right here. US average closing costs are somewhere between 2 and 5%. And again, I got all my data and I have all my sources listed here, but based on this, the average closing costs run somewhere between 2 and 5%. I just use 2% to be conservative, because I don't want you guys arguing with me like, hey, like you used 5% closing costs, that's too high. So I'm being super conservative, but for a $500,000 purchase, we can assume reasonably that the purchase cost that you're gonna be paying is about $110,000. Now, before I go on, I want you to understand that when I say something is a cost, I'm simply talking about any time that you have to fork out money. So if you're putting a down payment on a home, that is a cost, even though, yes, you are getting the money back when you eventually sell the home because that down payment becomes equity, but up front, it is a cost that you have to pay out of your pocket. So I'm counting it as a cost, even though it's a down payment. So purchase cost we're looking at is $110,000. The next cost that we have to look at for ownership costs are selling costs, because as you know, on average, the average homeowner will own a home for 13 years. So over the course of 13 years, if we're using averages, so a $500,000 home will be worth around $781,000 over the course of 13 years, just using averages. And how I got that number is I took the $500,000 that you see here, I took the national average appreciation of 3.5%. I know it might be higher in your area, in whatever market you're in, but the national average is 3.5%. So, and then I pretty much expanded upon it for 13 years. So that's how I got that number. The home is going to be worth around $781,000 on average in 13 years. So I took that number, what it's gonna be worth later, and I found the selling cost of that number. So I took the $781,000, I took 2% of that to account for the closing cost, and then I took the realtor commission that you're gonna have to pay if you list your home. And on average, if we look over here, on average, the realtor commission costs are 5.49% as a national average. So if you're gonna list your home, on average, you're gonna be paying 5.49% of what you get to your realtors, your listing realtor, and you're gonna be paying out to the buying realtor as well. So on average, if we account for both the closing cost right here, and we account for the realtor commissions that are average, you're gonna be paying about $58,000 when you eventually sell the home in 13 years. Again, these are averages. But the next thing that you're gonna be looking at are the principal and interest payments for the mortgage. So as you know, we're putting 20% down on the home, meaning the lender is going to lend 80%, and you're gonna be paying that mortgage off over the course of 30 years, most likely. What I did to find this principal and interest, I basically found the monthly payment, and to find the monthly payment, I just use a mortgage calculator on Zillow, putting 20% down, using the average mortgage interest rate in the US over time, which is 3.76%. So I used that interest rate, I did a 30-year mortgage, and I did a 20% down payment, and I found a monthly payment of $1,800. And what I did there, to get the total principal and interest that you're gonna be paying over 13 years, is I took the monthly payment here that you see right here, and then I multiplied it by 12 to get how much you're gonna be paying in principal and interest over the course of a year. And then I multiplied it by 13 years to get how much you're gonna be paying over 13 years. So once you do that, you're gonna be paying about $289,000 in principal and interest. And that's not about, that's actually exactly, if you're using these exact numbers for the mortgage. Now, the next thing that we're gonna be looking at is the insurance. So over the course of 13 years, you should plan to pay around $33,000 in insurance. And how I got this number is I did a separate study on insurance. So I go to my insurance tab. And what you see here is as the home value rises over time by the average appreciation rate of 3.5% right here, the insurance cost will also go up. And on average, like based on the national average, the insurance can be calculated as 0.4% of your purchase price. And again, I got that from my study back here, looking at the average insurance cost. Again, I used this website to find this. And keep in mind, all these websites, they're not all scientific studies. I think some of them are, but for the most part, it's just what I can find on the internet with sources that seemed somewhat reliable. So there might be certain errors, but for the most part, we can figure out the answers based on this data. But on average, for insurance, you're paying about 0.4% of your purchase price or your home value to get the annual insurance cost. So pretty much what I did is as the home values rose over time by that appreciation rate, the insurance cost also rose. And over the course of 13 years, you're gonna be paying about $33,000, which is what you see right here for insurance. That's how I got that number. The next cost that you're gonna have to pay as a homeowner are property taxes. Now, property taxes, I did another separate study just like insurance, and let's go to that study. So taxes, same kind of thing. Home value over time rises by the average appreciation rate of 3.5%. And over time, property taxes rise over time. And on average, in America, the property tax rate is 1.10%. So that means if a home is worth this, $517,000, 1.1% of that is $5,600. So that's your annual property tax. That's what you have to pay in property taxes over the course of the year if your home is worth this much, on average. Again, every market is different. Like in my market in Fresno, my tax rate is about 1.25%. So it's different in every market, but on average, that's what we see. So I did the same study over the course of 13 years. you are going to be paying total property taxes of $91,000. So I got that number here for the property taxes. And you can see already that these costs, they're starting to really add up for being a homeowner. Now, the next cost that we have to look at are the maintenance costs. Now, maintenance costs are the costs that most people associate with when they're comparing ownership versus renting a home. And how I got this maintenance cost is I did another separate study on it. Okay, go to maintenance. So the home value, the initial home value at least, is $500,000. I did not account for appreciation here because there's no need to when you're accounting for maintenance cost. So if we go back to the summary page, you'll see a key piece of information. Where is it at? Right here. On average, the US maintenance cost is 1% of the home price, the purchase price. So if I go to this maintenance study that I did, based on the initial home value, you should expect to pay 1% of this purchase price every single year in maintenance and repairs. So this is stuff like fixing up a toilet, fixing up cabinets, the little things over time that you have to fix and repair. So you should be expecting to pay $5,000 every single year over the course of 13 years to get you a total maintenance cost of $65,000. I also just found out that this should be changed. Hold on, total maintenance cost. Let's make this nice, it bothers me. Okay, so $65,000 over 13 years. That gets you $65,000 for maintenance that you have to budget for as a homeowner. The next thing that you have to budget for are something called capital expenditures. And if you're not familiar with capital expenditures, they're basically big ticket items that you have to account for when you buy any home. So these are things like an HVAC, basically your AC unit, a pool, a roof, water heater, any big ticket items that you don't have to pay like by month, but these are things that you have to pay in chunks. So maybe 10 years go by and your HVAC unit or your AC unit breaks. That breaks, you don't just pay $10. Now you're paying a lot of money to fix it up. And so we're just budgeting for that. And over the course of 13 years, based on data that I found on the internet, you can estimate to pay about $6,600 over the course of 13 years for capital expenditures. So I just plugged that number in right here, put the $6,600. Of course, this is always gonna vary market to market, but I'm just using the data that I can find online. So over time, you can see that the total hard cost associated with owning a home is $654,000. So over the course of 13 years, you can expect to fork out $654,000 out of your pocket over 13 years. Now, these are just hard costs. So these are costs that you actually have to pay out of your pocket. Now, that doesn't tell the whole story. We are not simply going to compare the hard costs for owning a home versus the hard costs for renting a home. There are more costs associated that a lot of people forget about and don't even think about. But before we get into that and the other costs, let's first look at the cost of renting a home right here. For the rent, instead of having purchase cost, like for a down payment when you own a home, you're gonna have a security deposit instead. Now, this is kind of the same thing as a down payment. You're going to pay a security deposit up front, and eventually you get the security deposit back when you move out of the home. Ideally, if you take care of the home. So even though you get it back, it's still a cost up front because it comes out of your pocket. So the purchase cost on a home is a security deposit. So the next thing that we're gonna look at is the selling cost. So over the course of 13 years, you likely will move out of your rental and you will get the security deposit back. So you'll get that $2,700 back. Now, I forgot to explain this at the very beginning, but I chose a rent amount of $2,700 because it was comparable to your mortgage payment when you're comparing the monthly payment plus the insurance and the taxes. It all kind of levels out to around $2,700. And I wanted to compare a rent that was equal to the mortgage amount plus insurance and taxes, if that makes sense. But you get your security deposit back and that's your selling cost. So you get it back, so it's a gain. The next thing that you look at is probably the biggest expense, or it is the biggest expense when you rent, just rent. So whenever you rent a home, you can expect to pay rent pretty much the same amount every single month. And of course, this rent will grow over time just based on the average rates. On average, at least from the last 10 years, rent in the US has increased 3% every single year. Of course, some years are higher, some years are lower, some years are much higher, but on average, based on the last 10 years, it's about 3%. So I accounted for that in the numbers. I have a separate rent study. So I took the 13 years that we're at, I took the monthly rent that we're starting at, the $2,700. Rental growth is about 3%, so this rent will grow 3% every single year. That's kind of what I did, and then I annualized it. So I multiplied this monthly rent by 12, and I assume that it's gonna grow 3% every single year, getting us a total rent of $506,000 that we will be paying over the course of 13 years if we were to rent this kind of home. So that $506,000, that is what you see right here. It's rent over 13 years, and I already accounted for rental growth. So when you look at just the hard cost right here, you're looking at homeownership cost of negative $654,000. So that means you are going to have to pay out of your pocket $654,000 over the course of 13 years compared to a comparable rental price, and you're gonna be paying $506,000 just as a rental. So when you look at just the hard cost, you might already be thinking, whoa, like it looks a lot cheaper to rent because you're not paying as much versus when you own. But this doesn't tell the whole story. This tells just the hard cost, what's actually coming out of your pocket. There's also other things there, such as the income that you get when you sell your home after the 13 years, and there's also opportunity cost. And I'll explain that later, but when we look at the difference in hard cost, when you just look at the costs that actually come out of your pocket, renting versus owning, based on averages, it is $261,000 cheaper to rent versus own. That's not the final answer though. We also have to look at the income from selling your home after 13 years. So the expectation, as we spoke about before, is that the home is gonna be worth $781,000 based on the average appreciation of 3.5%. So you don't just get the $781,000 when you sell your home. You have to pay your mortgage balance off. So the mortgage balance, and again, I got this just by typing it into a mortgage calculator on Zillow, and then I looked at an amortization table to show me exactly how much was going to be left on the mortgage balance after 13 years exactly. And the amount was $279,000. So when you sell your home, essentially what's happening is that someone is gonna pay $781,000 for this home, but once you receive that money, your title company will have to pay off the mortgage balance, meaning you have to subtract whatever mortgage you owe from the profit that you think you make. So that gets you income of $502,000. That's what most people see when they own a home. So for example, they buy a home at $500,000 and 13 years later, they sell it for $781,000 and they think, oh my gosh, I made such a killing. Like this thing is worth $281,000 more dollars than what I bought it for. Like it was a great investment, but they don't see all the costs that they actually paid for the home over the course of the 13 years. And that's what I wanted to break down to you today. So the income that you get from selling your home after 13 years is $501,000. Some of it was already your own money, like the purchase cost. Some of it was just equity that you gained over time because of appreciation. So the other thing that we do have to look at, and this might be controversial to you, but it's opportunity cost. And if you are not familiar with opportunity cost, it's essentially an economic term and it means the cost that you lose out on. So, okay, so the opportunity cost that you see here of owning a home versus if you were to rent, you have an opportunity cost I calculated of $394,000. Most people do not think of this cost because they're only thinking about the hard cost that we talked about earlier, the costs that actually come out of your pocket. But there's also very real cost of not doing something, the alternative. So basically how I calculated this $394,000 cost is I took all the different costs associated with being a homeowner and I said to myself, okay, look, if I were to rent a home instead, and if I were to use all that money that I would have used on a home to buy it and to maintain the home of being a homeowner, and I invested it instead in the stock market, where would I be instead? How much money would I have earned or saved if I were to rent and invest that extra money instead of putting it into a home? So Basically, what we're looking at is this. So before I explain the breakdown of this opportunity cost, let me just explain that I'm using a conservative stock market annual return of 6%. I think the average stock market annual return is about 9% or something like that, but I just use a lower return just so no one comes at me and comes for my throat saying, hey, you use too high of a return on the stock market. So I'm just gonna use 6% to keep things simple, because I think that's pretty low compared to what's realistic. So we're gonna look at this. Opportunity cost, this is the entire breakdown of this cost. I took the purchase price. I took this $110,000 that comes from the down payment and from the closing cost. And I pretty much said, okay, how about we, instead of using that $110,000 to purchase a home for the down payment and closing cost, what if I instead invested it at 6% in the stock market over the course of 13 years? So that's the calculation right there. This calculation right here is pretty much the purchase cost over 13 years invested in the stock market. The next thing I did is I added the selling cost that you see right here. And the selling cost, I didn't do any extra calculations to it because that's the cost that we're gonna have to pay at the end of the 13 years when we sell the home. So I just took the cost at the value of $58,000. I also added in capital expenditures of $6,600. And again, I had no idea where to put it as far as on the timeline of 13 years. So I just assuming that at the end of the 13 years, you're gonna have to fork up $6,600. So that's what I used there. And the last thing I used was the maintenance cost that I'm gonna have to pay over time and what we would have done with that maintenance money, like to fix up the home, if it was invested in the stock market. So in order to do that, I had to do a separate study. So I went to the maintenance tab. Let's go here. As you saw before, to calculate the maintenance costs, it was 1% of the initial home value. So you're paying essentially $5,000 every single year. But I'm not just gonna take the $5,000 every single year and take the $65,000 as our opportunity cost of what we lost out on, because there's more to it. When you look at the $5,000 that you pay, so this is year one. First year, you have to pay $5,000, but there's a real opportunity cost associated with the $5,000 that you have to pay. So for example, this calculation right here of the opportunity cost for this $5,000, this is saying, okay, look, if we, instead of putting this $5,000 toward fixing up a home, maintenance and repairs, what if we instead invested this at the 6%, that's what this summary thing is, what if we invested that at 6% over the course of 12 years? And you get 12 years by taking 13 minus 1. Because you're holding this for 12 years. And so I did that for every single year. That's the calculation for every single year. So basically, this $5,000 over the course of 13 years is actually worth $10,000 if you're assuming that you can earn a 6% return every single year. These are just assumptions, but that's how math works. So over the course of 13 years, the opportunity cost of these $65,000 that you're gonna be paying in maintenance and repairs is really $94,000. So that's the opportunity cost that you have to pay. And I included that calculation right here in the opportunity cost calculation. Now, the one thing that I did not calculate in this opportunity cost section is the principal and interest, insurance, and property taxes. And the reason why I did not include that in the opportunity cost section is because really, this amount right here is pretty similar to like the rent amount. So most people, when they're comparing whether or not they should buy a home versus rent a home, they're really just comparing, okay, the mortgage amount plus interest plus insurance plus taxes, and they're also comparing the rent. So this is essentially the same thing as this. So I did not compare these two, right? Or this versus this. So based on all this other information, opportunity cost is essentially a soft cost. It's not a hard cost. So it's not a cost that comes out of your pocket directly, but it's what you lose out on. It's what you lose out on by not choosing to rent. What you lose out on by not picking the alternative. So after doing all this work, we come to the final conclusion. I'm going to reveal it right now. The actual net profit or the net loss on owning a home versus renting the home. And before I reveal it, I want your opinion in the comments. Do you think it'll be better to own? Do you think it'll be better to rent? And I also wanna know, do you think one will be positive, one will be negative? Do you think they'll both be negative? So do you both think that they're both gonna be losses? Or do you think you're gonna profit by owning a home? So tell me in the comments below, and now let me reveal it, boom. So if you're confused by what these numbers mean, this right here is saying that if you want to own this particular home over the course of 13 years, you will lose $421,000. There's a real cost to owning a home. And similarly, if you rent a similar home over the course of 13 years, you will lose $506,000. So whatever option you choose, you are losing money because it costs money to live. Even though people think that if you own a home, you earn all this appreciation. So they think if you buy a home at this $500,000 and you wait 13 years and now it's worth $781,000, they're like, oh wow, I gained $281,000. That's a profit. It's like, no, it's not a profit. You have all these different costs associated with owning a home, and it comes out of your pocket to lose $421,000. So as you can see, the conclusion of this particular video is saying that based on the averages, all the average data for the US, it is technically better mathematically to own a home versus rent. Now, this surprised me actually because I thought it was going to be cheaper to rent over time, but when you really calculate for the rental increases, no, it's actually better to own a home over the course of 13 years, which is just the average. Now, I want you to take this conclusion very lightly because even though the data does say that based on averages, it is better to own than it is to rent, there are two main factors that can have a huge impact on these numbers. The first factor is the opportunity cost. Now, here's what I mean by that. If you were to rent a home and say you had the same amount of money that this homeowner had to put a down payment on and pay all these different costs, if instead of investing that money and earning a 6% return, this number will be drastically different as far as the opportunity cost goes. So for example, let's say you decide to rent out a home, and instead of investing it at 6%, instead of that, let's just say you blow the money. So if you're gonna blow the money and like spend it on things that you didn't even need, like consumer items, you buy cars, you buy clothes, fashion, like all these different things, games, whatever. And instead of having all this money invested at the conservative rate of 6% return, let's say there really is no opportunity cost because based on you and your personality, you were gonna waste that money anyways. So if you do that, this really goes away completely, the opportunity cost. And it brings it down to like a no-brainer of owning versus renting. That being said, if you were also to earn a great return and you trust your ability fully to earn big returns, whether it's in the stock market or in real estate or something else, like for me personally, I'm pretty confident that I can earn 15-20% return on most of my money just from real estate, flipping houses and stuff like that. Let's say I can earn 20%. It has a pretty drastic impact on the numbers. Now, based on these numbers, it's saying that it's cheaper to rent versus owning a home. So this all depends on the opportunity cost and what you plan to do with the money if you were to rent the home. That's one of the main factors. The second biggest factor is going to be this rental rate. Now, of course, all these factors do matter, but the rental rate and how much your rent will increase has a huge impact on these numbers. If, for example, you are renting in a place that never raised rents, which does happen a lot in real estate. Often you find a homeowner that never wants to raise their rent. And let's say this increase, the rental increase is 0%. Watch what happens to these numbers right here. Wow, I didn't know it was gonna be even, but assuming that your rent would never increase, it's basically saying, based on the numbers, that the cost of owning versus renting a home are the same. About $421,000 over the course of 13 years. Now let me undo that. So all these different things have an impact, and even though the math might say one thing, and you might be looking at your specific market to make differences, like for example, the national average appreciation is 3.5%. I know in my market over the long term, it's been about 8.5%. So if I change that, 8.5%, it makes me actually profit over time for owning a home. So I'd profit $85,000. Keep all that in mind, like all these numbers do change, but this study is based completely on averages. I want you to keep that in mind. And also, just because the math might say it's better to own, or even if it said it was better to rent based on averages, doesn't mean that's what you should do. This study is simply what the math says. Now, I took a completely unbiased approach to this financial analysis. I just looked at the data. I had no idea what the results were going to be, and I was curious myself. So that's why I did this study and this analysis. But even if the numbers say one thing, like it's better to own, doesn't mean that's what you should do. It really depends on your own life situation, what you can afford, what kind of money you have, and it also depends on your spouse or your partner. If, for example, the study said that it was better to rent over the long term, and you're trying to argue to your partner and use a video like this to explain to your partner, hey, like, we have to rent over time, you probably will lose that argument. It's kind of hard to argue with logic a lot of times with a partner on this stuff. And so it depends on your relationship with your partner. If you have a partner, it depends on what you believe you can do in the stock market or in other investments if you were to rent the money and not just blow it. It depends on the appreciation right here. It depends on the rent increase that you can expect in your market. It depends on a lot of different things, but based on the averages, the numbers do say that it's better to own a home. So that's it. That's the conclusion. I didn't expect it. I thought it was gonna be cheaper to rent a home over time. I don't know why I thought that. I thought that, but I was wrong. Also, if you want help to grow your real estate business, whether you are brand new or if you already have deals under your belt, DM me the word coach on Instagram at JustinYouWrong. Peace.